Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming to our forum tonight, and welcome you all, and welcome us three candidates who have agreed to be with us tonight. The other six, or how many there? Five, six? Five have been invited, but I haven't heard back from them. So and we let them be ghosts, as it was said in the paper today. But thank you for having accepted our invitation, more or less the minute you were asked. So it was great to have that kind of feedback. Let me first acknowledge the Bunurong of the Kulin Nation, the traditional of the land we're gathering on tonight, and pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging. As we did at the last election, we feel that it's part of the role of our community group, unChain, to organize events like that, to give an opportunity for people to meet the candidates, listen to them before they make their choice in 3 weeks' time. 2 weeks today, see we have some people are counting. Well, you know, you can have a big rest afterwards, or some of you. But so yes, so we have, as I said, we have invited the other candidates, and the only thing I got out of it is I've been put on the One Nation mailing list, which is great. So they obviously got my email. So you know, we have organised this event at our own expenses. So if at the end, you know, the $2 connection or collection doesn't work anymore, we've actually got a square, and Rob over there is there. So if you want to help us organise this event, so we can do, for example, another one for state, you know, you're more than welcome to help us out. So without further ado, John Daly, who was our moderator 3 years ago and did a great job, has accepted to be our moderator again, except that he's not the CEO of the Grattan Institute as he was back then. And now he's doing lots of things, including being a professorial fellow at the law school at the University of Melbourne. And John is a Macnamara resident. So, John, it's yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Serge, and an enormous thanks to unChain for organising this. You know, this is kind of where democracy starts. It's called representative democracy for a reason. These people want to be the representative of us. You know, 150th of Australia, the electorate of Macnamara, and so it's really fantastic to see this kind of thing happening. So thank you, Serge, and thank you to unChain for making it happen, because I suspect without you it wouldn't be. We're here in the seat of Macnamara, once upon a time the seat of Melbourne Ports, but of course things have changed. It also had a redistribution at one stage, and what used to be a very boring seat has become a much more interesting seat. For those of us who are kind of political theory wonks, Macnamara is this thing you kind of learn about in political theory, that it's just possible that if you kind of have a three-way tussle, then depending on who comes third, that will kind of essentially wind up dictating who comes first. And, you know, people get really interested and upset about this because it sort of contravenes all kinds of theories of democracy. Now, in practice, right, it never happens, except for Macnamara. So it's a seat that political theorists get really excited about. So here we are, and we actually get to have a say as to not only who comes third, but more importantly, of course, who comes first, and who is our elected representative for the next 3 years, or until whenever the Prime Minister decides to hold yet another election campaign. So, the format tonight, we've got the three lead candidates who on past voting records have a plausible chance of getting elected. We have Josh Burns, who is the sitting member. We have Colleen Harkin from the Liberal Party, and we have Steph Hodgins-May from the Greens, who's also run in a number of previous Macnamara elections. So the format, I'm going to ask each of the lead candidates to make an opening statement. We're then going to discuss 4 key topics for this election: the economy post-COVID, the place of Australia in the world, integrity in politics, and local issues. Now, we're not going to have a specific section on climate change, energy and the environment, because that was the focus of another forum in Macnamara held just a couple of weeks ago. So I'll introduce each of those topics briefly and then ask each of the candidates to talk about it, and if it looks like we're running ahead of time, then I might ask them a follow-up question. So, after going through those 4 topics, we're going to have a carte blanche session. Serge was very keen to have a carte blanche session, of course, given his role as an elected advisor of French nationals in Australia and a Knight of the National Order of Merit of France. So in the carte blanche section, each candidate will have 2 minutes to talk about a topic that they really want to talk about, other than the 4 we've already been through. And then there's going to be a Q&A. A number of people have put in questions in advance, and we'll be asking those of the candidates. And then if we have time, and if you all promise to be incredibly well behaved and to ask questions rather than making statements, we may have time for some question and answer from the floor. We're going to be shuffling the order in which the candidates make statements or respond to questions, or respond to those each of those topics. I have picked a random order to start, and then we'll keep shuffling from there for the rest of the night. We're going to be keeping strictly to time. You will be out of here by 9:15 unless you want to keep drinking, which I thoroughly recommend. And the way that it will work is that you will, 30 seconds before the candidate is supposed to finish speaking, you will hear this. And at the time they're supposed to finish speaking, you will hear this. And if they keep speaking, you will hear this. I've always wanted to be a triangle player. So I believe in incentives. I'm a public policy wonk, so the incentive for not going over time is very high. We will finish, as I said, by 9:15, and without further ado, it's time to introduce our first candidate. So, the person who came first out of my very large sorting hat, with all the 3 tickets in it, was Josh, who is the Australian Labor Party's candidate for Macnamara. He was born and raised in Caulfield. He graduated in arts from Monash University, majoring in political studies. His first job was working as a teacher's aide and factory hand and in publishing. And I was quite interested to see how you could have actually done all 3 of those things as a first job. I was kind of trying to see someone as a teacher's aide and simultaneously being a factory hand. Presumably it was on as a farm school. And writing about it at the same time. And for 4 years he's been a senior advisor to the Premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, and he was first elected to this seat in 2019. So Josh, you have 4 minutes. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, John, for the introduction, and thank you for moderating this evening. I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Bunurong people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And no matter who you vote for this election, I hope that if we are able to form government, we will take this country to a referendum. And if we do take this country to a referendum, no matter what position I'm in, I'll be committing to realising the Uluru Statement from the heart, and I would urge all of you that no matter where your political allegiances lie, you would join us in that important reform for our country. It's about time we recognise the 65,000 years of history and establish a voice in our Constitution to reach a treaty and to tell the truth about our country. To unChain, to all of the people who put this on, I know that this takes a lot of effort, and so to help put this on, thank you very much. To Colleen and Steph for turning up. This is not the first debate, it's not the last. Democracy is hard work, and to both of you, good on you for standing up for your parties and for being here tonight. And I'm sure it'll be a great debate. But elections are about the future. It's about the future of our country, and I think in order to think about the sort of future that we want to shape in this country, it's worth pausing on the past that we've just had. It's been an extraordinary couple of years. Extraordinary. And Australians, I think, have shown a sense of decency, of generosity, of community spirit, of personal sacrifice to help get us through this moment. I mean, it's extraordinary that people have stayed at home in order to protect the welfare and the lives of their fellow citizens. They've gone and got vaccinated, and I think our community has done a wonderful job of standing in solidarity and together with one another. And my honest thing tonight is, if you really stop and think, do we have a government that really reflects the very best of what it is to be Australian? Is our country fairer than it was 3 years ago? Are we more united than we were 3 years ago? Are we more divided as a country? is the leadership in our country the very best of Australia? There are things that I think we can fix in this country. It's not right that a woman or a family can't work full-time because of the prohibitive costs of childcare. We can fix that. It's not right that our senior Australians are not living a dignified retirement. It's not right that they can't get the medical attention that they need, and it's not right that they're not living in the standards that they deserve. We can fix that. It's not right that younger Australians are going to be, almost a third of them, working in insecure jobs with stagnant wages. We can fix that. It's not right that Australia, despite being on the forefront of climate change, is a laggard on the international community, insulting our neighbours and our Pacific friends. We can fix that. And I don't think it's right that politics in this country hasn't reflected the very best of what it is to be Australian. That our politicians in our federal parliament have maybe let this country down. We can fix that with a strong anti-corruption commission that holds our politics to a higher account. Friends, there are things about the future that we can be optimistic about. There are things that government can do that can make our country stronger, more decent and fairer. I have had the privilege of representing our community, and I am eternally grateful. But I also believe that our country can be better, that our government can be better, and I want Macnamara to have a seat at that table. I'm looking forward to this debate tonight, and most importantly, I'm looking forward to the future of our great country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josh. Next out of the sorting hat was Steph Hodgins-May, who is the Greens candidate for Macnamara. She grew up in Blampeel, which is about 20 kilometres north of Ballarat, and she lives in St Kilda. She graduated in Law and Arts from Deakin University, and she completed her Masters of International Relations there. Her first job was as an environmental lawyer, and she's worked as an advisor to the Australian Mission to the United Nations and as a volunteer lawyer at Environmental Justice Australia. Steph, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and what an absolute pleasure to be here with you all this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung people and pay my deep respects to elders past, present, and any First Nations people joining us tonight, either in person or online. I'm proud to be part of a party that has 20% representation of First Nations people in our parliament. And I also want to commit to taking forward the importance of truth, telling, justice and treaty in the next term of parliament as your representative in Macnamara. A little bit about me. I did grow up in country Victoria, but I now live with my family in Elwood, my young son and my partner. Most recently, I've worked for Greenpeace as the head of Pacific, and I've worked with frontline communities on the front lines of the climate crisis, who know that the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming is moving from their homelands, loss of cultures, of livelihoods and of land. Throughout my professional career, I've been guided by the imperative to act on the climate crisis. And that's why I stand in front of you this evening and why I've contested this election. This is the third time I'm running for Macnamara. But other than climate, I just want to express my deep commitment to this community. It's a beautiful place to live, and I'm incredibly proud, and I know many of you here tonight are incredibly proud of our beautiful community. But something that disappoints me is that for too long, I've watched on as our politicians in the major parties have been guided by vested interests rather than the interests of our community and our people locally. I am here because I'm listening to our community and I want to represent your views in Parliament. Not those of my donors, not those of the lobbyists that I've seen crawling the halls of Parliament, but genuinely to represent you. And with the Greens, I'm incredibly proud of the coherency and the consistency of our policy positions on everything from acting on the climate crisis and truly tackling what is the crisis of this generation, through to the humane treatment of refugees. I've been absolutely appalled by the race to the bottom that we've seen between the major parties on these issues. And I'm crying out for some big ideas and some leaders to push forward those ideas. The Greens this election are taking a platform that a costed platform to this election that I'm incredibly proud of. And the first pillar of that is recognising Cost of living is ballooning in this country. During the pandemic, the rich got richer and the gap between those less well off and those wealthy grew. We've got a comprehensive plan to build 1 million new homes, including 6,000 here in Macnamara. We've got a plan to get dental care into Medicare. In 2010, when the Greens were in balance of power, we achieved so much. We got kids dental care. We became leaders in climate law across the globe. And we established some really incredible organisations that are still functioning today. I believe that we've got the big ideas this election and we've got the energy to implement them, and that's what our community wants. They want leadership, and you want people who, when they say they're going to support something, they will go into the parliament and support it. This seat is incredibly important. We're on a knife edge here between Labor and the Greens. It's the Greens' next most winnable seat in the country, and your opportunity to have a representative who will truly champion the people of Macnamara and the issues that we care about. Integrity, action on climate, true action on climate, not just tinkering around the edges, and reforming bringing down inequality by addressing the housing affordability crisis, by looking after our older people and ensuring our young people have a fair crack in today's society. So it's a great pleasure to be standing here tonight, and I look forward to a robust contest of ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, we have Colleen Harkin, who is the Liberal Party's candidate for Macnamara. Colleen grew up in Caulfield and East Malvern. She went to school in Windsor, not very far from here. She completed an undergraduate degree in education at the Institute of Catholic Education and a master's at Monash University. She taught in a number of schools before starting a small business that developed bespoke databases. And more recently, she has worked in the office of Senator Jane Hume. Colleen.
Thank you and good evening, everybody. First of all, a little 2 seconds about me, my background in terms of growing up with 4 brothers. I tell you, that gives you a bit of a thick hide to learn to live life with. And my background in teaching has framed part of my view of the world, that if you give a child a great start in life, it will hold them for a very long time in their future, and the importance of doing that. But why am I standing here in front of you is because I have fundamental beliefs in the freedom and individual choice. And what I see from the opposition and what I see from the alternative view is an increasing desire to take control of our lives. I want freedom of choice of the life that I want to live. I want reward for effort. I want to keep my money, more of my money, to be able to choose what I want to do with it. And I want to look after those people who are unable to look after themselves. I want to give our kids the greatest start in life with the best education and the best opportunities that they can give. I want our children to grow up with hope and optimism, not be bangered down with fear and anxiety that's happening at the moment. I want all of these things for myself, and I want them all for the community, not just Macnamara, but Australia more broadly. So all of those things count towards how I see the world in all of the policy decisions that the Liberal Party make. They're founding principles of the way we see the world and the way we see taxes, the way we see every opportunity to empower people to live the life that they want to live. Lean government. Despite standing for government, I have a great desire to get government out of our lives. So my core sort of principles here, I agree with what's been said a moment ago about an extraordinary last couple of years. We've had, fires, droughts, floods, pandemics. It couldn't have been a more difficult time to go through. And despite all of that, we're actually in a pretty good place, which we can talk about more when we get to the topic of the economy. I'm not a career politician. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a single mum with a lot of life experience, and you'll notice as an evening goes on, I'm not a waffler. I have a tendency to go to the jugular and get straight to the point, so I probably won't use my 4 minutes or any other time during the evening. I'm quite matter of fact, and I look forward to the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. At this rate, there could be even more time for questions, which would be great. So the first topic is around the economy. I will confess that when I stood here and spoke to you 3 years ago about the economy, working out what we did about responding to a global pandemic did not make the cut. So I apologise for missing that one. Obviously, the country's been through a lot in the last 3 years, and COVID has dominated our economy, but we're all hoping that we're now on the far side of that. And we are back to the kinds of economic issues that are all very familiar. Cost of living is going up, prices are rising faster than wages, and despite nominal tax cuts, bracket creep means that income tax is increasingly eating into wages. For once, on the other hand, underemployment and unemployment are less of an issue, largely because interest rates have been put down so far through COVID, and also governments have pumped a lot of money into the economy. But that history of the last 3 years has left a whole bunch of big legacy problems. So the Commonwealth budget is in significant deficit at the moment, and when we say significant, we are spending about 27% of GDP, and we are earning, if you like, about in taxes, to the extent you count that as earning, income is about 24% of GDP. That is a very large gap. And newsflash, you are only going to close that gap by doing one of raising taxes or reducing spending, or some combination of the two. So that's a big problem for the next Commonwealth government to think about. Because when governments still run big deficits while the employment market is tight, and that is exactly the world that we are in at the moment, inflation goes up, and in response, the Reserve Bank raises interest rates. And that's going to put even more pressure on households. And that, of course, is the economic world that we are in. Now, productivity growth is one of the few ways that can get you out of this kind of impasse, but productivity growth is something that Australia hasn't seen very much of for about 20 years. So it's not the fault of the previous government, it's the fault of any number of governments that for one reason or another have not succeeded in getting things in place that are going to really shift productivity growth. People talk a lot about infrastructure and its potential impact on productivity growth, but there's a lot of concern that the infrastructure money that we are spending is not necessarily going to the right things that are necessarily going to have the most impact on productivity growth. And there are lots of other things we can do about productivity growth as well, and I'm sure that our candidates will talk about them. So I'm going to ask our candidates to talk about the economy post-COVID. It's a big topic, so you can have up to 4 minutes. Maybe on the economy, Colleen will use all of her 4 minutes. So we're going to have Steph, then Colleen, then Josh, 4 minutes on the economy. Steph, fire away.
Thank you, John. And I suppose just to go back a step, the economy was really tough on many people, and I think really demonstrated to us the incredible value of our essential workers. The nurses who spent their lives looking after us and risking their health and safety. The public transport drivers who kept our society moving. These people, some of the lowest paid people in our society, who may never afford to buy a house and who are often paying more tax than the multinational corporations, are the true heroes of the pandemic. I also want to point out that when we were facing this crisis, a number of political parties and commentators and the government came out with how they saw this economic recovery working. And rather than consulting with the people and the scientists, they consulted with the lobbyists and the coal and gas industry about what Australia's economic recovery would look like. And they landed on a gas-fired powered recovery. The pandemic provided an opportunity for us here in Australia to do things differently and to make the most of the sunshine and the wind and the opportunities that this country presents. To invest in local manufacturing of electric vehicles, to invest in a green-led recovery, replacing gas and coal with clean energy exports like hydrogen. The government appointed a commission to deal with our economic recovery, which included Neville Power, a well-known lobbyist and corporate in the gas industry. What does that say about the decisions of this government? We had an opportunity and we're squandering it. Economically, the Greens are going to this election, and we go to every election with really ambitious policies. You'll hear more about them tonight. But we also have a plan for how to raise that revenue to cover the cost of it. And let me tell you, it is not going to be targeting the essential workers. It is targeting the multinational corporations, the coal and gas industries that have been profiteering off our natural resources without paying their fair share. The Greens are the only party opposing the Stage 3 tax cuts, which don't help everyday people. They support the uber rich, and they support men significantly more than women. We support removing some of the unfair tax concessions that exist around negative gearing, which the Labor Party went to the last election with, quite an ambitious policy, but they've completely given up on it. With capital gains tax, these are big structural issues that we can and must deal with. And you know, I hear this talk about we can't tackle these big things because we'll lose votes. But I truly think elections should be about a contest of ideas and bringing people with you. You can't just say something and expect the community and the population to support it without really arguing the case for it and the merits of it. And I've read that negative gearing is actually removing negative gearing is an incredibly popular policy, and people get it because they understand that they want to be able to buy into the housing market and for their kids to be able to buy into the housing market. But meanwhile, we're seeing 20% increase in house prices with only 2% increase in wages. You know, that's incredibly unusual for a country like ours. Similar economies to ours are facing a much different issue where wages are growing more quickly than housing prices. So we need to address some of these structural issues that it's going to take courage, and it's going to take going out to communities and on the airwaves and fighting and convincing people of the importance of these reforms, such as we saw in the 80s and 90s, but has essentially been given up on by the major parties. So I'm really proud to be going to this election with an ambitious costed policy to create new jobs in the renewable energy sector, in the construction industry by building 1 million new homes over the next 20 years, and of really making the most of this recovery. Thank you.
I mean, there's a reality check in life. Australia is in a position where we have the lowest inflation rate, the lowest unemployment rate, the lowest women's unemployment rate since 1974, and the fastest growing economy in the OECD. So we're doing something right. Despite the rhetoric of some that would like people to believe that we're in a disastrous situation, we are and we remain and we will continue to be one of the luckiest countries in the world. Australia's just put up its interest rates yesterday by 25 basis points. US has put it up by 50 and New Zealand has put it up by 125. So the panic that is being pushed, the average mortgagee person has 42 to 43 months buffer in their mortgage. There is no panic scenario that the press would like you to believe. The population has been very prudent during the pandemic and the financial support that's been provided to people, that there's a massive buffer in people's personal economics circumstances. We'll be okay. This scenario where everyone's kind of like going, oh my God, the world's going to fall in. We're fine. We will be fine. The idea that we can propose to people these fantasy, utopian kind of views of the world, we live in real life with real consequences for real policies on people's lives, and we have to be fair income about what we stand for and how we're going to implement it. Many of you in the room, myself included, will remember a time not very long ago under the Keating Treasury of 17% interest rates. So, you don't remember? No. Relatively no. That's the point. The other line that was just mentioned a moment ago about there's only two ways that you can move forward in terms of the economy. There are literally line items in the budget of commodities that were put in at $55 a line, and they're now coming in at $110. So the debt reduction yes, the debt is extraordinarily large, but it is reducing at a rate faster than was even predicted. What some people would have us believe, we are in a very good place, and that's because the Liberal government's fiscal management, everybody knows it. We are very good at it.
Can you hear me? Is this thing on? Radio. So, unemployment doesn't tell the full picture. In this country, we have a growing number of people who are working in insecure work. It's about a third of the workplace are working in casual jobs. We also have people who are underemployed. It potentially could be closer to around 10% of the economy of people who, yes, they have a job and that doesn't qualify for benefits, but it does mean that they don't have a comfortable living arrangement. What we're seeing that sort of translate into is fewer and fewer people able to get into the housing market. If you're my age or below, around a third of Australians are able to even get into the housing market. So I think that when you talk about the unemployment rate as the only key economic factor, my honest view is that I don't think it actually tells a full picture of what's going on in the economy. In terms of where we are right now as a country, I agree with Steph in that you think about the people who really drove and kept our community together throughout the pandemic. They were people who turned up to work as childcare workers, as teachers, as people in our aged care homes. I mean, they were heroic, turning up into some of the worst outbreaks, especially in Victoria, before we had vaccines. And they're some of the lowest paid workers in our country. You can get more pay working at Woolies than you can working as an aged care provider in many instances. Our truck drivers, our distribution workers, our services, our hospitality workers, people who turned up and made food for us, they are the heroes of the pandemic. And yet what have they got to show for it? You know, where are we at right now in our economy that the services industry is able to show that they're in a better place than they were 3 years ago? We're seeing an increase in casualisation, a falling amount on real wages. We're seeing inflation not outpacing wage growth in this country. And as I said before, housing is becoming less affordable. So some of the solutions, and we do have inflationary pressures, we have to be careful about how we manage it. I think governments need to be responsible when dealing with these this economic reality, but there are things that government can do to try and take responsibility and try and ease some of the pressures that people are facing. One of the things that we're going to try and do is create a pathway to permanent work. So if you're working in a company and you've been there for 2 years, we think that that's a good threshold to be able to say, well, you should have a pathway to permanency in that company. We want to support a wage case, an increase of the minimum wage. We think that, especially for gig economy workers, we need to regulate so that people don't earn less than the minimum wage in this country, and we should increase the minimum wage while we're there as well. We think that supporting our aged care workers at the Fair Work Commission is an appropriate measure, and whatever the Fair Work Commission determines it should be the wages of our aged care workers, we'll pay that. We want to make gender equity an ambition of the Fair Work Act and an objective of the Fair Work Act. We want to build more homes to obviously not just deal with the demand side of the housing market, but also the supply side. We have an ambitious program to build a number of social and affordable homes, as well as homes for crisis accommodation and people fleeing domestic and family violence. So my overall view of where the economy is at right now is that we need to ease the cost of living for Australians. There's no magic finger, and I think that sure the government had a short-term measure in the budget that was a cash injection into the economy, but I think we need to look at more sustained, long-term structural aspects of our economy so that people have secure jobs, a fair pay, and can keep up with the cost of living pressures. Thanks.
Thank you. If we move on from the picture of the economy of Australia to the wider world, we're living in pretty uncertain times. We've had decades in which each year there were fewer conflicts than the year before. That's not where we've been for the last couple of years, and most obviously, of course, in the Ukraine, where war is back in Europe after decades of peace. All over the world, governments are spending a lot more on defence. And of course, we've heard a lot about China in the last few years, with lots of worries about Taiwan, the South China Sea, and Asia more generally. And those worries, of course, arrived on not pretty much our doorstep a few weeks ago with a security pact between China and the Solomon Islands. Meanwhile, of course, refugees are an issue. How do we keep our borders secure? What are our humanitarian obligations to those who have been displaced by conflict? And what are we going to do with the backlog of people who have claimed asylum in Australia? And then, of course, there are any number of international environmental issues, including overfishing, loss of species diversity, and pollution, not least carbon emissions. So, I'd like to call on the candidates, first Colleen, then Josh, then Steph, to spend 3 minutes each talking about their views about what Australia should do given its place in the world. Colleen.
There's a lot there, obviously. Well, everybody knows it's a pretty unstable environment that we're currently in as far as the global relations are concerned. But once again, Australia's in a pretty good position. We've got a great relationship with partners, trading partners and alliances. Our subs deal that was recently done is, nation-changing, really, in terms of our international security and our relationships. We've got strong borders, which has always been an asset to our domestic communities. We've pushed back against China, much to a lot of other countries' applaud and amazement at how we've been able to do that. Once again, like for example, we've been providing armoured vehicles to Ukraine, and the feedback on that is that they are absolutely amazing vehicles. The stuff that we're doing here is incredibly powerful, and Americans are looking at ordering them themselves. So we've got a Quad agreement. We're in a really great relationship status with other countries. That's not to say that things are looking fantastic, because, as I said, we all know that it's pretty tenuous, the situation that we're in. We've got free trade agreements with all of our trading partners. So all of these things are part of a matrix to sort of say Australia's in a good spot for moving forward. We put big investment into cyber security. I want to touch on the issue of refugees. People being in refugee status and for a very long time is, of course, that's not okay and it's unfortunate. But there's also the other side of the refugee story, that is, at what stage we must keep offshore processing. There is no change in the Liberal government's position on temporary visas. And I've never ever heard anyone say, despite our humanity and our best interests, a different solution that actually works. Every time we change that temporary visa approach, people die. No matter how well-intentioned people are, the solution of offshore processing is the only one that actually keeps the vultures away from good-intentioned people to get. I'm calling the boat people. Would you let me finish? I'm just saying, I'm using the wrong. The people who take the money from them. What are they called? The smugglers. Thank you. It's not that hard. Keeping the smugglers away from us. If you name any figure, name me, 2 million people who we say that's enough. That's our quota for refugees. What happens when the next person comes? There's never a great solution to any of this. It's always difficult stuff. So the government's position is no change on the temporary visa scenario. So all of these matrix of things, Australia actually, we punch way above our weight. We have great relationships with other countries, and once again, we're in a pretty good position.
So I'm going to start by talking about our place in the region, and then if there's time, I'll talk about asylum seekers as well. We are having a debate with the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre on Sunday week, so I'm happy we'll go into more detail on that night as well. Let's start with our place in the region. Penny Wong has said publicly that securing our region is the most important foreign policy objective that we have, and by our region, I'm talking about the Pacific and of course Australia. I think the government has talked the big game around the Pacific Islands, but I think that when you actually look at some of the outcomes and some of the details around not only defence capability but also the way in which they've managed, it really hasn't matched the rhetoric and the chest beating that we've seen from some of the senior government officials. Now, when you hear Peter Dutton talk and to be honest, try and appeal to Australia's worst instincts by some of the comments he made today, it really gets us no further into a more secure region and a more secure country. What we actually need to do is partner with our Pacific and partner with the region. The first trip I did as an MP was to Papua New Guinea. It was a former colony of Australia, but it is so much a part of, Australia is so much a part of Papua New Guinean identity, and yet in Australia we don't really think about it. It's not really a part of our consciousness. Yet how can we expect Papua New Guinea to not go the same way of the Solomon Islands if we don't do the respect and give it the respect that frankly Papua New Guineans give us in a constant basis. So what does that mean? Thank you. So what does that mean? It means turning up. It means partnering with them. It means elevating the Pacific Island voices. It means not cutting foreign aid. It means increasing foreign aid, but doing it in a way that partners with them. I saw an Australian school built in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Like, we do good work there, right? We really do good work. I've seen a medical facility in Kanantu, a place that is literally in the middle of nowhere, that has sterile rooms because Australia turned up. You know, we can change the lives of people in the region, and we can do it in partnership with community infrastructure. But unless we turn up and unless we give them the respect, then our region isn't going to become as safe as it needs to be. And I think that when you see the Solomon Island Defence Pact with China, it's astonishing that the Foreign Minister didn't go over there. It's astonishing that the Foreign Minister or the Prime Minister hasn't picked up the phone to the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands. You know, we can't expect our government to be treated with respect if we aren't willing to turn up and treat our Pacific Island friends with the same amount of decency. You know, I say this sincerely. I've seen the Greens' comments on China, and I think the Greens are treating China as too benign. China is becoming more assertive. They are a big power, and we have to be careful about how we talk about China. I think China is trying to encroach on Australia's national interest. We saw them try and restrict Australian imports and exports into China, wine and other industries. We have to be honest and open about it, but I think we have to do it in a way that doesn't appeal to the worst of our domestic political instincts. We have to do it in a responsible way. We have to find a balance between, you know, admitting that China is not benign, but also saying that, you know, that whatever Peter Dutton is doing in terms of chest beating, and having the Director General of ASIO call him out for it. So, friends, we have a lot of work to do. We have to get cracking. We have to treat our region as our first priority, and I hope that with Penny Wong as the Foreign Minister, we'll have a chance to do that. Thanks very much.
Many people think of the Greens, they associate us with climate change, and sure, that is one of our founding pillars. But peace and non-violence is an incredibly important pillar, one of our four pillars of the Greens. And that really guides our approach to foreign policy and Australia's place in the world. I've worked and I work on the front lines of the climate crisis with Pacific Islander people every single day. They are talking to me about climate change. The communities, the presidents, the high-level officials, this is their number one concern. They are so excited that I'm running for this seat because they see it as an opportunity for us to push, for the Greens to push for science-backed policies that will ensure their future. As I said, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming is their existence. It's not just the Pacific Islands. Globally, climate change has been identified as the biggest risk we face. So why aren't we acting like it? Why aren't we investing in relationships that are multilateral relationships to deal with the climate crisis? Because if you're worried about a few refugees moving from islands to Australia now, you ain't seen nothing yet. With China. In relation to China, the Greens have been calling out human rights abuses in China for longer than anyone. But we also recognise that our relationship with China is very important. They're a significant trading partner, as is the US. And so what we are asking is that we don't blindly follow the US as we have done for so long. The Greens' position is that these sorts of significant decisions should be debated in the Parliament. You know, wars cost billions of dollars and they cost lives. So why are the two major parties so willing just to go it alone and not negotiate and not debate these significant issues with the representatives of electorates right across this country? You know, if the Greens weren't in Parliament, there would be no debate on these issues of national security. And frankly, we don't think that billions of dollars spent on submarines that we mightn't see for 20 years is a good investment. And we don't think that blindly following the US is Australia's role. Australia has the opportunity to help broker peace in our region, because a war between China and US is not going to end well for Australia. And I want to thank you, and I want to touch on refugees as well. And in addition to what I said, we're going to see mass movements of people who do not want to leave their homelands but have no choice because they are in low-lying parts of the globe that are incredibly susceptible to rising sea levels and extreme weather events. I have been appalled, and I'll say that I have a personal connection to refugees. My partner is a refugee, and his mum brought up him and his three brothers here in Australia. And Philip Ruddock was the foreign minister at the time, and he took care of these families. He invested in them with social housing and opportunities. My mother-in-law now has her master's in social work and has worked in remote communities right across Australia. These refugees seeking our protection don't want to have to come here, but they're fleeing wars that we initiated and were very much involved in. And the least that we can do is provide them with the support and security to settle in their lives here. It's appalling, the race to the bottom between the two major parties who are talking about who can be crueler. It's a disgrace. It's an utter national shame, and they have blood on their hands. The Greens are the only party opposing offshore processing, supporting regional processing, and taking a humane approach to people seeking our support to this election.
Thank you. Our third topic is integrity in politics. My first real job was as a constitutional lawyer. And I thought that constitutional law was a sort of, niche topic for eggheads, and I was, never going to actually see any of the things that I kind of worked on hit the national stage, let alone an election. Well, I was wrong, because when Serge asked me to do tonight, one of the four topics he nominated was integrity in politics, and as an ex-constitutional lawyer, I agreed with him. And there's been a lot of talk about a Commonwealth Integrity Commission analogous to, say, Victoria's IBAC. Should we have one for the Commonwealth Government? How should it work? For example, should members of the public be able to refer things directly to it? Should it be able to investigate things without having to get permission for anyone? How much of its hearings should be held in public? Should politicians be subject to it? But there are, of course, lots of other integrity issues. Lots of people are worried about pork barrelling, which has been increasing from both Commonwealth and state governments over the last number of years. Lots of people are worried about political donations. Should there be more timely and more detailed disclosure? And of course, the Commonwealth Government has less timely and less detailed disclosure than I think any of the state governments these days. And admittedly a bit of an egghead topic, but it's very important. The balance of power between our public service and ministerial advisors has been changing. And again, this is not specific to one side of politics. It's been happening under both sides of politics, all sides of politics, and at both Commonwealth and state levels for a long time. But it makes a big difference to how we're governed. So, lots of things to talk about in terms of integrity in politics, and I'm sure our candidates have other topics they will want to raise as well. So I'm going to ask them to spend 3 minutes each talking about it. First Josh, then Steph, then Colleen. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So, let me start by outlining, first of all, our proposal for a federal anti-corruption commission. I think this is one of the central pillars of what of a legacy that we can leave if we are elected into government. The first thing is that it needs to be independent. It needs to be able to examine issues or matters that it feels where corrupt behaviour may have occurred. It's not good enough that a federal anti-corruption body would have to wait until a federal government or the executive of government refers a matter to it. It needs to be able to examine what it wants to examine. That's the first thing. The second thing is it needs to be retrospective. So it needs to be able to look at matters that have happened in the past. It can't just be restricted in the sort of timing of matters it investigates into. And then the third thing is that we do believe there should be public hearings. Politics and politicians should be afraid of a federal, well, they shouldn't be afraid of a federal anti-corruption commission because you shouldn't be in politics if you are. But if you are, you should be mindful that a federal anti-corruption body can hold public hearings. So I think it's important that we have this and we introduce this. We've said that we're going to get it done by the end of the year, and it will be one of the biggest pieces of reform that we get started on as soon as we get into government. The second thing I wanted to talk about in terms of integrity in politics is, I have spent the last 3 years in the federal parliament, and in some ways it's been the privilege of my working life, and it's been extraordinary to witness some of the best of our democracy. We see collaboration across all political parties to try and, especially in the committee rooms, to try and tackle some of the problems and issues and policies that confront our nation. It's really good. But there are also aspects of the federal parliament that I think, obviously, we all have seen are deeply, deeply uncomfortable and deeply problematic. I was there when Brittany Higgins gave her speech outside the steps of Parliament. It was one of the most extraordinary moments I've ever experienced. And what came from that, and what came from Grace Tame as well, raising her voice in an extraordinary way, was Commissioner Jenkins, Kate Jenkins, was commissioned to do an inquiry into the way in which Parliament conducts itself. And it's really important that we implement and realise all of the recommendations of Commissioner Jenkins, and that's what the Labor Party has committed to. I say that, and I say that, it was extraordinary to be outside and to experience the moment that was the Brittany Higgins Day, but to go back inside the Parliament and to hear the Prime Minister say, well, such marches in other countries are met with bullets, I think was quite a stark picture and snapshot of where our country is up to. So we have a lot of work to do to not only reform the way in which our Parliament operates, but the way in which politics operates as well. Thanks very much.
The Greens first introduced an ICAC, a National Anti-Corruption Bill, in 2010. And we've introduced this bill every single year since. And consistently, the major parties have voted it down. But I'm very encouraged to hear that the Labor Party is coming to the table on this and that it is going to be a priority of the next government, and we'll certainly be pushing that right along. What I want to also talk about, though, is political donations. And this is something that I truly believe is eroding our democracy. I've been in Canberra and I've seen the lobbyists crawling the halls of Parliament. We saw what happened when we tried to introduce a mining tax in this country, and top executives from the fossil fuel industry were in the rooms helping negotiate it. Why every minute $20,000 of public money is going towards subsidising the fossil fuel sector? It's billions and billions of dollars. And why? Why are the major parties not following the science on the critical issue of our time, climate change? Well, when you see the donations that come into the major parties from these vested interests, you understand why. Big coal and gas aren't going to donate to major parties out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because they have an agenda, and they're doing it because they know that it works. The Greens have self-imposed disclosure limits of $1,000. And it does impact on our ability to fundraise for people who don't want their identities disclosed. But we self-impose that, and we think that it should be a requirement for all political parties to cap donations at $1,000. We also have been pushing to have limits put on MPs and ministers who finish up their tenure and then go and work as executives at Santos. And both of the major parties have got ministers who have done this. It's eroding trust in our democracy. It's making people think that it's a farce, and it makes being a candidate very tricky, can I tell you, when they ask why a standard's applied in some industries and not in politics. We also are appalled at the position of the major parties to try to suppress protest in this country. We have a proud history of protest, and I've stood alongside the climate strikers fighting for their futures on the streets of Melbourne. And to put this at risk is a deeply grave position to put our democracy in. We're also fighting for greater media diversity because we know how harmful it is having a media that is dominated by Murdoch and pushing negative fear agendas every single day. So these are some of our priorities.
I thought it was interesting to hear Josh propose the ICAC terms of reference, because that's actually been part of the problem. There's a 300-page document sitting there that the Labor Party actually won't address properly. Within the document, it actually has an inherent guilt before you even start the process. So if you go, everybody supports an ICAC, everybody wants that process to be fair and reasonable and transparent, but you can't start with a position that says this person is corrupt and now we're going to find some evidence. So that's the core problem with what's been going on with the ICAC scenario.
No, that's not correct.
It is correct. Anyway, let me continue. It is correct. So everybody wants an ICAC scenario, but it has to be a legitimate, fair and reasonable and transparent process. As far as the other items that have been addressed, political donations I'll address. I did hear Steph say just 2 nights ago we had a debate, and she mentioned that she was fortunate enough to be able to fund her own campaign through an inheritance. And
My cost of living, not my
said your campaign.
No,
well, it's on video. We'll go back. And Zoe Daniels has been given $1.2 million in her campaign in Goldstein and won't disclose it. Zali Stegel got
We're talking about governance.
Zali Stegel in New South Wales, $100,000 donation that she chopped up into smaller pieces so that she didn't have to declare it. So the issue of integrity and donations actually falls on the side of those who don't want it to be known. If you have a $1,000 donation, it will only mean that only the wealthy can support campaign funds. People ought to be able to do whatever they want to do with their money and have it transparent, for sure. And that's the issue that's going on at the moment. Zoe Daniels with the $1.2 million doesn't want to tell anyone where it came from. I will send you the video of her herself saying it.
Mr. Mediator, bring us back to the issue.
So the further issues are integrity in politics and raising the standards of politicians. About 2 weeks ago I had a debate with Josh and Steph, and literally in the next sentence after Josh talking about the personal standards of politicians, he personally abused the Prime Minister with swear words. And then we have and there you go. So you guys want to stand there and talk about integrity in politics and raising the standards of politicians, you get the opportunity. There's also the issue of
corruption's a lot worse than swear words.
68% of this electorate did not vote for Josh, and so most people actually would prefer to see people with higher standards of politicians, and that includes behaviour of all politicians. The behaviour of the Greens candidate Lydia in the Senate is absolutely appalling. 62.
That is terrible.
So, if we can, part of this is no doubt that interjections happen. That happens in any political meeting. But if we can try and keep it to the point where a candidate can actually get their views out, that would be good. So, the fourth topic that I want to introduce is local issues. We're electing a representative for Macnamara. Representative democracy is what it says on the tin. Our representative represents us as a local community and is supposed to represent the issues that matter to us as a local community. Now, given that I'm the chair of the Australian National Academy of Music, I have promised not to talk about any of the things to do with the South Melbourne Town Hall. So instead, I'm going to note that everyone here has got their own road, their own neighbourhood, their own childcare centre, school, sporting ground, arts facility, health centre, aged care home, or whatever other local...
With pleasure, thank you, John. We have a beautiful electorate, but of course it can be better, and I'm standing up here because I do want to protect what's great about our community, but also enhance it. A number of our commitments have really gone to local environmental conservation, and this stems from the fact that many of us spent years in lockdown. I was in a tiny apartment with an ever quickly growing toddler, and just really, I think previously might have taken for granted the beautiful open space we've got, the parks, the bay, and so a lot of our commitments go towards recognising the importance of those community spaces and enhancing and protecting and growing them. Similar to the arts, you know, we're in the arts precinct, cultural capital of Australia. And John, I know you said you wouldn't mention the National Academy, but yesterday we made a commitment to support the extraordinary work of ANAM and in restoring the South Melbourne Town Hall to its former glory plus more as a new community asset to be utilised by our wonderful local community and to, I think, really enhance South Melbourne as a cultural arts precinct. Local childcare centres have been, you know, really fighting for their existence. Three community-run centres in St Kilda and Elwood. And I've been so proud to be standing alongside the parents and the toddlers in really fighting for the future of those centres. And as far as I'm aware, the Greens are the only party who have said we will chip in up to $5 million to support the future of these centres. Because this is a time when we should be building new community-owned centres, not closing the existing ones. We know that we need to be moving away from dirty, fuel-guzzling vehicles and are incredibly proud to have the strongest electric vehicle policy going into this election. We want to bring down the prices of EVs for people because we know they're out of reach. We want to provide tax incentives and we want to get rid of the state government's EV tax on drivers who want to transition away from fossil fuels to electric vehicles. And this includes the building of 375 new charging stations here in Macnamara. Most people can't afford a house with a garage to charge their car, so there should be publicly available EV stations so we can keep our roads moving and keep noise and pollution down. In relation to our nature-based announcements, I was at Elstonwick Park Nature Reserve yesterday with the wonderful local hero, Geo Fitzpatrick, naturalist who spent his life giving back to our beautiful local areas and supporting bird life and revegetating them. And we're really proud to be committing $12.1 million towards delivering the master plan for Elstonwick Nature Reserve, of investing in the Melbourne pollinator corridor to get more bees and biodiversity into our city streets and to allow kids to get their hands dirty and enjoy nature and appreciate nature. We want to upgrade Albert Park because we recognise how many sporting clubs are dependent on that facility for the health and wellbeing of kids and for great community sporting initiatives. There's more, but I know that I'm about to run out of time, but that just gives you a flavour of some of the issues that we're prioritising and I'm prioritising here in Macnamara.
The Liberal Party has also previously pledged budget to the South Melbourne Town Hall redevelopment and ANAM's rehoming there, or back to home. So that money's been sitting on the table for some time, waiting for the state government to come to the party, just for local issues there in terms of, and turning that area into a bit of a piazza, really, like a magnificent place to enjoy music and artworks. We also have a pledge, we've actually made pledges just recently in the last couple of days to the Albert Park Sailing Precinct down the northern end of Albert Park, a magnificent proposal by those clubs along that top end to create a sailing precinct. Albert Park College use that facility every day, and to extend those services for the college and their outdoor education program that they use for their Year 9 students. That's already been pledged in the last few days, and we also pledged for the Powerhouse Rugby Club. They're the oldest sporting club on the Albert Park facility, and they've had a proposal in place for over a decade, actually, working on some plans, and they have no facility at the moment. So the Liberal government has pledged pledged support to those in the last couple of days. Macnamara has the highest density of artists and musicians and events management businesses in the country, actually. And we're very supportive of they're all small businesses. Most of those environments are small businesses. And when I'm out on the hustings, I can't tell you how many of those who say they would not be in existence if it hadn't been for JobKeeper. That they're very much looking forward to they can feel the mood has changed when people are ready to get back out and support what's going on in their industry, and they're very grateful that their head is still above water. We also have an electric station policy to increase or to develop further power stations for electric vehicles, and I won't go into the local childcare centre issue because it is a local issue. But I should say local council issue, not federal government issue about the closure of those 3 council kindergarten childcare centres. So our support of the local businesses is really where our key performance indicators are. Liberal Party is, was and always will be a supporter of small business and help empower those businesses to do what they do best.
So I actually think that it's really good that there are 3 positive ideas of what our community can benefit from, and I think that that's a credit to both the candidates on my left and my right, that they also deeply connected to the community. It is an amazing place to live, Macnamara, and I'm proud to be the member, and I'll outline a few of the local things that I'll take you on a bit of a journey down through, a bit of a tour through Macnamara and some of the ideas that we've got. The only thing I would add as a sort of front line or as a sort of umbrella statement around it is I think that as a federal government, it is a big arm of government, and often it is better when you are developing these local policies to partner with other layers of government to ensure that there is actually community buy-in or community incentive. I think we've seen federal governments invest in local projects that haven't come to fruition because they haven't done that homework. So that's been something that we've been really conscious of when trying to develop. The first one I'll mention is the Elstonwick Nature Reserve that Steph mentioned. We've committed $11.7 million if we are elected to government. $10 million will go towards the park, and $1.7 million will go towards the Elster Creek. The 2 parts, or the 3 parts of that project, one is the naturalisation of the old golf course. It's magnificent. If you haven't been down there, do yourself a favour and have a mental health walk through there. It's going to be spectacular, but it's also going to help with flood mitigation. There's a project going on in collaboration with the state government to divert a whole lot of water outside of Elwood via a Head Street bypass. Elwood is a flood zone. In a high tide, it is prone to flooding, and that project, as well as the beautification of the park, is really exciting. The other part is the Elster Creek. That is a project where basically there's an old aqueduct that takes you from the park out into the bay, and it ends up having really contaminated water, and it's something that if we naturalise it a little bit without slowing down the flow of water, it will make it pretty spectacular. So we're going to chip in a bit of money to that. Our Albert Park Sporting Club proposal is all about, like if you go into some of these change rooms and we're talking about facilitating female sport, it's pretty confronting to just have urinals in change rooms, and we need to upgrade it to make it fit for purpose. If we're serious about facilitating female participation in sport, we've got to do things like that. Albert Park is a magnificent precinct, but we need to upgrade those facilities. We've outlined $3 million for the Fisherman Bend transport option. I mean, that's a corner of the electorate. We've got a huge amount of growth, and if we don't do something about public transport options in that part of the community, the rest of Macnamara is going to eventually turn into a car park. I'll run through it really quickly. We've got $128,000 for the new arts campus between Albert Park College and the Victorian College of the Arts Secondary School, a new headspace in South Melbourne, $50,000 for an outdoor gym at Elwood Secondary College. We're going to put a community battery in South Bank, and we've just announced today that we're going to create a new an urgent care clinic somewhere in the vicinity of the Alfred Hospital to assist with access to medical care. There's some of the things that I hope we get a chance to deliver for our wonderful local community. Thanks.
Thank you. And as promised, we have a section which is to talk about whatever you would like to talk about that we haven't got to yet. You have 2 minutes to talk about the topic of your choice. And Colleen, would you like to go first?
I guess I want to really touch on the issue of fair incomeness and what's actually real and what isn't. And I asked someone tonight, I hope they're here, to run off and get the brochures that have been dropped in letterboxes. But I hear people talk about environment all the time and looking after the environment. And I just want to show you something, thank you, that came in our letterbox drops. We've given one single piece of paper to the entire electorate. The Labor Party has given the equivalent of seven pieces of the same size, right? The Greens, that's Labor, Greens have handed out 17 pieces of the equivalent size. So it goes to the issue of who walks the walk and who just talks about it. There are other issues. There are other issues with the same thing. The Labor Party actually has mentioned policies of a nurse in every facility 24/7 by next year. It is physically impossible. We don't have the nurses. They're talking about owning half of your house, but if you ask the question, what happens when I want to extend that house? There's no answer because they haven't thought it through. What happens when my salary increases? Do I have to sell it? They don't know because they haven't thought it through. It's been thought up over a bottle of wine with 24 hours notice to put it out. There is a real issue here. There is a real issue here of what is real, what is achievable, what can we do to actually make people's lives better realistically. Stop putting nonsense in people's heads that are ambit claims that are unrealistic and unachievable, and do what is fiscally the right and responsible thing to do, that we will all move forward together. Stop terrifying young children with claims that it's an emergency and they're growing up frightened. 8-year-olds are scared. It's an absolute disgrace. So my point is, what is real and what is utopian ambit claims?
If ever there was evidence of a bit of a tired government void of ideas, I think we can say I'm going to go on a completely different track. If you suffer from insomnia, I would encourage you to pick up my copy of The Crumbling Australian Dream. It was a piece of writing that I did during the first lockdown, and it was an extensive look at the situation of housing in Australia. It was analysis on the state of play. It was an analysis on what government had done historically. It was an analysis of what can be done. And it paints a pretty bleak picture about housing affordability in this country. Fewer and fewer people can own their own home. In fact, I would go as far as to say it's never been harder to own your own home in Australia. It's a pathway to financial security. In 2008, a study was done by Per Capita. That study outlined that if you were able to get into the housing market, your net worth at the end of your journey, working for 40 odd years in this country, was around $980,000. If you weren't able to get into the housing market, your net worth was $40,000. It's an extraordinary way for Australians to raise capital. And yet when you think about the journey of young Australians entering into the workplace, what are they going to have to show for 40 years of work for our country? It shouldn't be easy, but it should be possible. Yeah. And that's what I tried to get in through our housing, my Crumbling Australian Dream policy piece. The other things that we explored was around the rental and the security of rental properties, as well as the absolute necessity of the federal government to turn up and build social housing. Like, it's nonsense that the federal government says that that's a matter for the states. It's a choice. Curtin and Chifley did it, Whitlam did it, Hawke did it, Keating did it, Rudd did it, Plibersek did it, Gillard did it. Labor governments do it. If we are elected into government, I will be so proud, and that is one of the areas I'll be working extremely hard on to get building for our country. Thanks very much.
I'm going to take a different tact again, and it's very much based on the conversations that I have had with women across our electorate over the last few months. And in particular with women working as essential workers, as nurses, as childcare educators, as people caring for family members that are unwell or have disabilities. Women aren't paid enough in this country. There is a huge gender pay gap that we can and must bridge. I've spoken to women who are in their 50s and they're physically broken from working in these sorts of industries. They've got minimal superannuation, minimal financial security, despite having spent their lives contributing in caring roles. They're one financial consequence away from finding themselves financially insecure and potentially homeless. I've met with the Salvation Army in the last week and I've met with Sacred Heart Mission, and they said throughout COVID, access to accommodation and the demand for their services spiked dramatically, up to 100% to 200% increase. They're calling around private hotels to try and find crisis accommodation. I want to close the gender pay gap. I want to recognise the unpaid caring work of women in our society. I want paid leave to, superannuation to be paid to low-income earners who are taking maternity leave. I want to invest in affordable housing that's truly affordable, and to stop treating housing as though it's a property investment but a human right. And I want to support women-led business through microfinance loans and through tax incentives to help women get a head start, because we know that when we give women that head start, they will succeed and they will be huge employers of our society into the future. So we can and must eliminate the gender pay gap, and we need more women at the table making these decisions about policies that will affect them, not taking notes for the men. Thanks.
I'm going to ask Catherine Sharples to come up. Catherine's a part of unChain, and a number of people have put in questions in advance for tonight's forum, and Catherine's going to ask the questions and our candidate's going to answer.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the people who have submitted questions. There was quite a lot that came in on email, and I've tried very hard to make them a succinct question for the candidates to answer, and we won't ask any questions that have already been addressed tonight, and hopefully we'll have time then to open questions to the floor. The candidates haven't had any advance notice of these questions, just to let you know. So to get to it, the first one here, are you prepared to support a rewrite of the Migration Act 1958? And do you agree in particular that the following matters need to be addressed? The personal powers of the Minister, the limits on the length of immigration detention, character-related decisions and refugee and bridging visas.
I think we'll go Josh first and then
So it was Minister length of...
Personal powers of the Minister,
Yep.
limits on the length of immigration detention,
Yep.
character-related decisions and refugee and bridging visas.
2 minutes.
Thank you for the question, Catherine, and for whoever submitted the question. Yes, we will need to rewrite the Migration Act. So in terms of indefinite detention, I moved motions in the House of Representatives calling for the end of indefinite detention. We need to not allow for people languishing in detention. We absolutely need to abolish temporary protection visas and safe haven visas, the SHEV visas, and in terms of the discretion of the Minister, absolutely, there are times where the Minister has overreached. I would also say that the Minister has the ability to use their discretion for good. One of the first briefs that Christina Keneally will sign as the Minister for Home Affairs will be to allow the Murrugappan family to go back to Billawheeler. We're going to increase our humanitarian program. We're going to double it to 27,000 people. We're going to create community-sponsored places. We're going to dramatically transform this policy area. We're going to go into it next Sunday. I'd encourage you to come along. It's something I'm really passionate about, and I hope we get a chance to reform this important area.
Steph?
Yeah, absolutely need to reform the Migration Act, and to see the godlike powers of the Minister with the stroke of a pen can decide someone's fate. It's not natural justice, and it's appalling. There's no ability for... A court can make a decision and then the minister can come in and override it because of his personal opinion, and that's got to change. Indefinite detention, the Greens have always been fighting against the ongoing indefinite detention of people seeking our protection. I was at Park Towers a couple of months ago and watched these men who have been locked up in torture hellholes by the major parties for 9 years. All that was separating us was a pane of glass and the stroke of a pen. Thankfully, some of these men have been released, and one of them I got to meet recently after 9 years in detention. He's a 36-year-old guy who's going to have lifelong medical conditions because of the food that he was fed and the treatment that he received at the hands of the Australian government, and with no objections from the Labor Party. The character test, to see it recently, we saw both major parties, and the Labor Party disappointingly backflipped on their position of reforming the character test. And Josh, I saw you speak on ABC News and defend that decision, which I just found so unusual, given that 2 months earlier your Labor Party were arguing against it. The Greens want to increase our refugee intake by 50,000 spots per year, and recognise in particular the people in Afghanistan who have been fighting a war that we were part of, we're turning our backs on them. We've got to end the offshore detention. We've got to invest in adequate offshore processing, and we need to recognise that the wealth of intellect and knowledge and professionalism that these extraordinary people can contribute to our society here in Australia.
I'm not sure whether you agree or disagree with the powers of the Minister, Josh, just from what you said and Steph. But look, I mean, I agree that there are times and places when the Minister's personal powers have been found to be the correct thing to do. Well, interestingly, you all cheered when he said that the first thing that by ministerial power she would do would be to let the Billowell family relocate. Anyway, let's go on. Indefinite detention is a difficult one because there are times when people arrive without any identification at all.
Oh, it's all
and it is
bullshit.
very difficult to trace a person's genuine claim to refugee status or not. Now, 9 years is clearly extremely unfortunate. So indefinite detention is a really difficult scenario. But in terms of the refugees, for example, you just mentioned Ukraine, Steph, the Australian government has already invited almost 3,000 Ukrainians into Australia in the last few weeks, and nearly 6,000 more have been offered visas to come. 6,000 Afghanis have been invited, are already here, and another 6,000 have been invited to visas. So we do our bit in these environments. The character test, Australia has evicted or deported, I think, nearly 10,000 those who have status in other countries. Now, I think that's a good thing. If someone is doing things in our country that are criminal and of unsavoury character that ought not to be here, then we ought to have the courage to deport them.
Thank you. Refugees was one of our most often asked questions, and the second was housing. And I know we've touched on that tonight, but I'm going to ask the candidates to answer one question in relation to that. There has recently been media coverage and political rhetoric that's conflating housing security with home ownership. Many people will never be on the home ownership ladder, so can you please explain your policy position on housing security for the most vulnerable?
Excellent question. And the Greens are going to this election as part of our fully costed platform is to build 1 million new homes over the next 20 years in Australia. A proportion of this will be public housing, because we're seeing there's just woefully inadequate public and social housing being built in this country. And I visited Beacon Cove Estate this week and was appalled to hear about residents of 40 years that are about to be kicked out of their homes. We're also going to create a shared equity scheme, which would allow first homeowners to buy in to a house that would be capped at around $300,000 for that property. And they can choose to buy that property and live in it. But at the time that they want to sell it, it gets sold back into that equity scheme. So we keep a stock of affordable housing for first homeowners to purchase. There'll also be a percentage of those properties that are available for rent. And if people rent in those properties and then find themselves in a position to buy, they'll be able to purchase into that property and then also, again, be able to sell it back into the scheme. So it removes the property speculation and ability to profit off housing stock. It addresses the supply side of the equation, and I've seen commentary today that's saying that both of the major parties' housing policies isn't going to do anything to address broader housing affordability. Similarly, it'll ensure that we're creating new jobs in the construction of these homes, of these sustainably built homes over 20 years. I also want to say that the Greens are the only party this election recognising the inherent structural issues associated with negative gearing and capital gains tax, and bringing a policy that will actually help put a cap on the housing prices that are escalating at a rate that we just is not sustainable and we can't keep up with, and truly acknowledge that housing is a human right, not a property investment.
So the Liberal Party has a benefit scheme called the Housing Benefit Scheme, where last year 137,000 new home projects were undertaken and 300,000 people were seen into their own new first home. We've got a policy of 2% deposit for single people and a 5% deposit for couples. That means that we do encourage and put the wind in the sails of people to get a house for themselves and invest in the market and get on their way in life. The biggest way to do that is by having a job. And our encouragement of small business and getting people into work with a 4% unemployment rate is the lowest in nearly 50 years. So our position in the world is to get you on your own feet, because once you are on your own feet in your own home with your own choices, your life takes a completely different path. Being permanently dependent on others doesn't give you the freedom of choice that you deserve in your life.
I'd flip that actually a little bit and say that housing actually allows you to have opportunity and stability and security in your life, that if you don't have it, it becomes very, very difficult to do things like apply for jobs and get ahead in this life. So we do need to absolutely have more homes available. Everyone should have a safe and secure home. I think as an ambition as a country, to say that we all deserve a safe and secure home is a good place to start. In terms of the rental market, it is obviously regulated by the state governments, but I don't think that's an excuse for the federal government to not insert themselves into the conversation. One of the things that we're going to set up is an advisory panel, an expert panel on housing. It's going to try and operate in a way that brings the states into the federal government to look at things like land opportunities, look at things like demand for housing in particular areas, giving good advice to government about where the opportunities are to build more homes and what can the federal government do to leverage those opportunities. So I think the answer to rental properties and providing more secure rental properties is working with the states and territories, not against them. In terms of shared equity, it was obviously a big announcement that the Labor Party did last week. It's starting with 10,000 places per year, and what this does is for low and middle income earners, people who are earning under $90,000 as an individual or up to $120,000 as a couple, can get a shared equity home from the government. I think this is, this will transform people's lives, and it is so good for taxpayers. Like, I'm not sure if you've watched the property market, but it's going up and it consistently goes up. Like, the taxpayers are going to make money off this thing, but most importantly, it's going to give people a chance to start raising capital and finding that financial independence. So I think it's a brilliant idea. I certainly am open to different ideas around shared equity, but government absolutely has to start with government saying, we're going to turn up, we're going to try and think about these issues, and we're going to try and help. And the federal government, I think, could do a whole lot more, and I hope we get a chance to do it. Thanks.
Next question. Gender inequity is a key driver of gender-based violence. The first ever national plan to reduce violence against women was brought in under the Gillard government 12 years ago. With recent discussions targeting groups of women, namely trans women, and the frightening discussions in the USA around abortion access, women's safety and autonomy is constantly under threat. How do candidates plan to address gender inequity and gender-based violence to ensure a future where women of Macnamara and the women around the country are safe, respected and have autonomy over their bodies? Colleen, you're first up.
Yeah, that's a really tough question. Apparently, 1 in 4 females have been sexually abused in their lifetime. I mean, that's a very frightening stat, shocking stat. But by the same token, according to the Jenkins report, in terms of bullying in Parliament, for example, 62% of it was. So there's a story here of both genders. Poor behaviour of all kinds is totally unacceptable.
Bullying and rape, same thing, everybody.
I didn't say that. Acceptable. I've forgotten the rest of your question because I've been interrupted.
Yeah, sorry. Respected and have their bodies.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is it's not just women, it's women and men, and we all have to be respectful to each other, no matter what your gender is. It starts with us. Each of us is an light. It's not a word we use very often. Recognise that body is a percent of silly people. Most people are actually pretty good. So I want to make the point that it is unacceptable at all levels. And the idea that we blame one small section of the community, I can't abide to. I want everyone to realise that
Radio. So prevention obviously is got to be something that society puts a whole lot of effort into, and respectful relationships and encouraging young people to be respectful to one another and respecting our different sexualities, genders, race, religion is something that needs to happen from a young age. But what I might do is my answer is actually to different communities. Whether it's LGBTIQ communities or whether it's religious communities or whether it's Indigenous communities, there are cultural sensitivities that we need to be mindful of, and to have special situations like what we've got at the moment where each and every night. So I think the answer to the question is we need to do more to support people to help break the cycle of violence and empower them to say that you are supported and you have an opportunity to do something else. And that's a really difficult thing, and there's no judgment there. It's just something like it's have these kids who already have times more likely to commit suicide are being picked on by a government who is pretty muscly and pretty strong and should know better. So I would just say that we don't have a problem. I've never been lobbied to try and deal with issues of so-called
the debate that's at the moment. And the Greens fundamentally believe that abortions should be free, accessible, affordable and safe. We want to create that's very much worthy of a clap. We want to fund public hospitals so that people can go to a hospital close to where they live to seek these services. We want to make safe access zones so they're not pestered by people on their way in to what is, of course, a traumatic and really hard decision to make as a woman. We want to, in relation to ending violence against women, on average, 1 woman is killed every week by domestic violence. 1 Australia's. We want to invest $12 billion over 12 years to support the national plan for ending violence against women and a standalone national plan for first violence of it. And so we need to address this crisis looking at those
Before I go on with some of the audience from different interest groups and different walks of life, one of the things unChain wants to do tonight is give everyone the opportunity to ask a question later and to give the candidates a chance to speak. You don't have to agree with them. We were sent, and it wasn't by... the Greens recently committed to 12.5 million. Will the Liberal LP match that? Colleen.
20, I think it was, off the top of my head. And it's waiting for the state government to do its part. We've already put money in the bank, it's sitting there waiting for it to be matched by the state government who...
The only thing I would add to that is that it's a council building and the federal government has put $12.5 million on the table, the Labor Party and the state government through options. There was
talk of some discussions around ownership of the building and how it can be managed. So it's complicated. There are a few roadblocks. It's a magnificent facility, and you know, Keating established it, and it's been a great Australian institution ever since. So obviously, I'd love to see ANAM realised, but that's the status quo at the moment.
Excited to see the South Melbourne Town Hall restored and rejuvenated so that it can be accessed by ANAM, but also.
And again, this one was touched on, I think, by you earlier, Colleen, but I am going to ask it even though it's centres. Elected, what practical support can you offer to ensure ongoing access to affordable early childhood services in Macnamara? Josh,
and childhood. It's not the time to be shutting down local services. We should be investing in local services. So I've met with the Mayor, I've met with the services. We had a meeting between Amanda Richworth, who's our Shadow Minister for Childcare and Early Education, and our services. We've put in writing that we will work, that there are some significant resources. The truth is that there's 3 centres find a viable solution for these affordable early education centres. We want there to be choice. We want there to be affordable childcare. That's why we're going to increase the rebate to up to 90% for almost every family in Macnamara, to make sure that that 4th and 5th day of childcare and early education isn't a prohibitive factor for families, especially women, to get back into the workplace.
I love community-run childcare. My have the most extreme centre, but what makes it extraordinary is the staff and the community and the volunteers that create these havens for our young people in those formative years. Certainty, crying out for commitments. You know, they know that this is the window, this is the opportunity before a federal election, before a state election, to get solid commitments on the table. Not just talk of we want to support you and we hope it's okay. Spend and also community-run services. So the $5 million to support the refurbishment or the relocation of these centres, because we recognise that community-run childcare looks after our kids and it teaches them, and we don't support the privatisation of centres. We don't think people should be profiting off our children's parents believe that why should it cost money when secondary and primary school are publicly funded? So we want universally free childcare in this country to recognise that investment.
Early education by that. But the first 3,000 years of a child's life are the most important. The access that they have to stimulus, mental stimulus, is critical. So in terms of proposing, if we're elected, we would obviously to provide fantastic facilities for young children to be able to have the best.
Now, it wouldn't be an unChain forum if I didn't know. What is your personally for St Kilda Triangle, and how do you think that project should be progressed? Steph, we're starting with you.
What do you want? No, I'm joking. Look, generally we come from a principle of enhanced green space in this. Certainly I'm involved in deliberations with community members, nor unchained about this particular issue, so it's your member.
With anybody stand in conversation, but the idea of place together, City Square, Piazza, whatever you want to call it, it's just a fabulous environment of community consultation on that one.
So it's been a while since we've had a cup of tea in my office with the team from unChained. We had a plague in between that, really early on in all of that process, and have it has been presented, so it's kind of in a state of holding. In terms of what the vision is, well, obviously the community needs to have a say in that, and I think that we are really hard pressed for great open session.
Thanks. I don't think it'll be much slower. Macnamara is for the political theorists, because one of the questions we had is please explain.
Our first on first preferences, my two adversaries seem to think it's a two-way race. Labor get across the line on Greens preferences, and this election there are 8 candidates, and we have preference Lib Dems, and I think, Steph, I think we've put you 7. I'll put it as some. So our view is that we can get across the line ourselves. This electorate is really interesting, it's really chunky.
Liberal Party has about 36% of the first preference votes, and then most definitely not.
Or political preference order as a suggestion on a piece of paper in whatever they think will give them the best chance to win the seat. And that's the honest truth, right? So that's how we deliberate our preferences. The other thing also that is factored into that is who we believe should win the seat if it's not our own party. And so Steph and I had a look at Steph's preferences, and we have exactly the opposite, except for 1 and 3 substituted. I've got animal justice number 2, Steph is at number 3, Colleen is at number 4, the Liberal Democrats at number 5, the UAP are at number 6. There is an independent character who belongs at number 7, and then One Nation will carry up the field. My honest answer is that I think preference
corruption body, and generally we think this Morrison government has been a complete and utter failure. Ahead of the Liberals, because we know people are ready for change, and we've said not work with the Liberals. So I just want to emphasise that yes, preferencing is preferences, and I always do find it strange when people say, who are you sending my preferences to? And say, put your number 2 where you want to send it. But I just want to say that I think one of the biggest things in this seat that people don't understand is that it's one of those rare contests in the country where you can elect a Green. I disagree. I don't think Colleen has a chance this election, because we saw the Morrison government. We know that your vote is going to send a message to the Labor Party that they need to be better on issues like refugees and climate, but then your vote will also go to them in full, so there's no such thing as a will not support them, and if Josh is elected, he will not either. So you have a really strong chance of sending a message this election. Climate, migration questions around Israel and Palestine, questions around the machine of government, the big housing government project in Port Melbourne. I encourage people to ask those questions of candidates themselves. So the last question I'm going to put to the candidates, though, is we know there are many diverse groups in Macnamara. I think that was described as chunky a minute ago. There are many diverse groups from whom we've had questions.
Great question. Whoever gets to be Mara, it's something that I'm sure they will do with everything they've got, and that's certainly how I've tried to treat the job. I've never asked someone how they voted when they walk into my office. It just doesn't happen. The IQ community, we have a large Christian, we have a growing Indian community, one of the populations of public and social housing in this country, in any electorate. Of that is parts that I've spent time in and tried to represent them in the federal parliament and be a strong voice for the issues that they care about. I think that the way in which we create energy and technology in this country creates jobs, lowers power bills, tackles climate change, and brings leadership back to Australia. We need a government that acts on integrity in this country. I think Macnamara absolutely expects that. I think Macnamara is a force of good and be a force for good in the federal parliament, and to represent and to bring the people of our great community with me whenever I get a chance to speak in the House of Reps. Whoever gets elected, it is a great privilege, but if I am privileged enough to be the representative of Macnamara, I'll give it absolutely everything I've got.
Fairness and honesty. Well, you know, if you've got me as your representative, the Greens have a consistent and coherent set of policies. When we're asked whether we're going to support something, we don't need to go and do a popularity, know what I stand for, how we'll use the most important thing that an MP has, their vote in the parliament. Door knocking and conversations have been a huge part of my campaign and our campaign here in Macnamara. We're used to grassroots campaigning, and we relish the opportunity to hear from people from MPs from the Charmin Stone, an incredible national senator, and with Melissa Parks and Alana McTiernan, who were in the Labor Party. We worked on issues of conscience, and I think there needs to be a lot more of that in our parliament. And you have my commitment.
Macnamara is a fabulous seat. It's quite what I just procedurally, like Greens around 23, around 35%, and Labor about 32%. So whoever ends up representing you is ever only on the first preference vote a high percentage of Jewish community, high percentage of LGBT. So it would be an absolute. We overuse. I haven't thought of another one to use at the moment, but to be able to represent broad does have a sound and sustainable process towards net zero 50. Is to take. It will happening. There are amazing things support. For example, there's a business at the moment that has really thin film, like instead of shields that cut 8% of the heat and the heat. There's amazing manufacturing that is being encouraged and empowered. So it's through sensible to net zero 50.
Many of those candidates, and we're handing back to John.
We've got time for questions on the floor. Thank you for coming. I'm going to impose a couple of restrictions on the ones from the floor. There's a microphone over there and one over there. Please ask a question about something that we have not heard.
My name is Jake. This is a question. Prime Minister's support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It was a colonial and Colleen First Nations voice established by as its first. Greens have indicated they don't support such as their first order of business from the Heart Nation's voice.
The Greens were the first the Uluru State. What we've been saying consistently is that we also need truth-telling and treating it happening at a state level, and they're leading that truth. So our biggest fear is that we don't get this over there. Won't be blocking the Uluru Statement, and we'll just be government with both all of these three simultaneous and incredible.
Look, I the Indian need, and platitudes are one thing, but actually educating the children, giving them an opportunity for a bright and happy future is actually something that really real action, real empowerment for the future of Aboriginal and Indigenous children.
The question, yes, and this needs to be a partisan issue. Like this actually needs to be, if we are going to pass a Uluru Statement, of course government should invest in services, right? Of course they should. But this is something that has been requested in history as the most horrific minister of this country. We must work together on this with the country to do it in the order that has been requested by our First Nations.
I'm a first year, and my question is directed specifically at Ms. Harkin, so hopefully this will be quick. You've stayed working alongside All Straight for Climate and Ancient Rebellion Youth, where I've seen incredibly intelligent and responsible young people working towards, what are you going to stand with the young people you once taught?
So there's a couple of layers to answer that. We have 8-year-old children who can't sleep at night because they're afraid the world is going to implode tomorrow morning. There is no way an 8-year-old child can be afraid of the climate unless we have taught them to be afraid. So the Liberal Party's view of ambitions and innovation and entrepreneurship. The plan is we are already ahead of our carbon emissions from Kyoto from 20 years ago. We're already ahead of it. It's not widely.
Question is for Josh and Steph. I'd like to know why supporting the demolition of the Barrack Beacon public housing estate in Port Melbourne. The buildings displaced. Sorry, do you mind you let the others? That's not acceptable. Let me just finish the question about the redevelopment. The residents are traumatised by the displacement. And the rest is a bonanza up as audible house.
The statement, Josh, if you'd like to ask the question.
So I didn't catch your name. Kerry, I'll stick around after this and maybe we can have a chat. But aware of the state government's proposal, and I understand there was a community meeting last night. I wasn't in attendance. There was some concern about the way in which it's been communicated for this project, and I understand that those channels are now being rectified. There is a desire to action with you, Phil.
Over here, sir.
Yes, my question's to all candidates. In a critical period in relation to climate change, and that the world has to terms with the climate crisis. The projection by Climate Analytics by 2030 will be producing 11%. What is reduce Australia's emissions by 2030? Thank you.
To do this in 1 minute or 2 minutes. The Greens' 25% reduction of emissions by 2030 is actually physically impossible. It would require 6.5 million houses to have solar panels, so it's produced down the track. We are ahead of our commitments. We will have net zero by 2050 through technology.
Yeah, how are you? For those of you who is one of the community activists who has consistently raised his voice, he cares deeply about this, and you know, an example of civil society, biggest decarbonising project on the table if we're able to get into government. We're going to legislate towards net zero. Our modelled and costed policies by Reputex will get us to at least 43% emission reduction by 2030. It means 85 solar banks around the country. It's all of our funds are going towards renewable projects. We're going to legislate to ensure that we don't getting stuck in approving each and every project. We're going to create strong climate change laws and get this done.
By 2030 is doable, but what it's going to take is phasing out mines. The Conservative International Energy Agency has said that we cannot have any new coal and gas mines. Yet the major parties have approved 130 basin, which is going to be WA's premier, proposing offshore exploration in Scarborough, and it's massive, massive emissions. And here in Victoria, we've got the premier trying to do this as a climate. This is why I'm running the parties on tackling the climate crisis.
Thank you. Each of the can make a two-minute statement in reverse order from where we started. So Josh. And you can, if you'd like to come here, you'll do it from there. Okay, thank you.
Well, kudos to all of you for sticking around. I think it's been a good discussion and a good spirit. Now, Steph, you vote in the federal parliament, and you know, like I have been in the federal parliament for the past 3 years, and there's put into the parliament between all of the is how we fall, and people approve or don't. But the truth is that we shouldn't be getting into the parliament and working out how we're going to vote on Morrison's bills. So that we're not 3 years thinking about how we voted on all the content. We hear what a Labor government achieved for our country. What a Labor government did. The election is tight. If Morrison can't win this election, then you need to remember April and how that felt. Our election is over. It is only just. I am a representative of the Australian, more so I'm a representative of our community. This community to have government, and I'm meant to be serving Australia in scene. Thanks, and I look forward to that.
Opportunity, Macnamara. Really proud participant. It's a pleasure to be sitting debating Colleen. I'm target politics. I want big ideas. I want lead our major. In the last term, 97% of where are the big election issues that we're facing? Time election again. Promising government we're going to, but it's just simply not happening. The contest between Josh and my contest of this, and it's a who is through represent community. If I'm a very high chance on the crossbench, negotiate outcomes for our. And that every time for people, what is best for it and what is best for I'll be guided by you, because I'm not going to be taking those donations that hinder for interests rather than the people. So I ask you at this election, if you want equality and have delivered by Medicare, put a 1 next to my name, just advocate, and work to a transformative agenda for.
Not sound very say economy. And I'm sure you're kind of sick of hearing that word, but nothing happened. 11, when it was last in power, there was no benefit scale. Under the last couple of years of the Liberal government, there's been 2,900 items added to the money, run out of money. So we might get something happen, sound fiscal management. So ideas that you hear that are big ideas and that people with us. Not leaving people, someone drank a bottle of wine, but when you actually surface and ask, they couldn't answer to have, and we do, the Liberal considered solutions to move forward for all people. I'll call you ballots. The next is a sustainable, achievable target. We are on with the doing things to bring everyone together and empower people to have the life you want to have. 21st, Colleen Harkin, Liberal Party number 1, because it is to get your life, live how you want to live.
Pleasure. Sometimes these are difficult, but you've made it very, very easy for me, so thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Serge to clean up.
Forums like that are not always easy to organise, but I think it's. I was very interested with the thing here, and so I've got a little present. Wine, but So I've got a small cake for campaign challenge, but I've got a little cake. All deserve the cake. So you before we are not ship or nothing. So if you on the way out to cover the room, and that will allow us to organise another late election. I'd like to unChain was in tonight. People here at Memo, I would say on the 20th or before. And thank you very much for being part of us.